One of the biggest problems I see in this space is the lack of bold bets. And it's partly, in my view, because crypto, it's so socially driven. Imagine if somebody released Friendtech V3 tomorrow and they just named something different. It would get destroyed on Twitter, right? It would say, this already failed, like you're trying to scam us, you're a horrible person, go die. Like, people get pretty intense about this. It's like, that's actually very dangerous for the industry, I think, because the second you're discouraging people from coming up with ideas that were different than before, simply because they didn't work in a different format before, then you start getting stagnated.
This episode is sponsored by Sei, the parallel execution EVM compatible layer 1 with sub-second finality. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. We'll hear more from Sei later in the show. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Lightspeed. We're back today with another roundup covering the week's big narratives and stories, and I'm super stoked to have my co-host Mert back with us. We took a week off because you've been traveling around a little bit, but I believe you're out in Singapore now, Mert. How's that going?
Yes, I am. It's going well. I was worried because they don't allow ZINs into the country with severe punishments. And also I figured out an arbitrage where you're not allowed gum, you're not allowed nicotine pouches, but you're allowed nicotine gum. So I just went to the pharmacy and bought a lot of Nicorette gum.
Is Nicorette gum? I'm not like a nicotine person, but is it similar to ZIN as far as the nicotine delivery?
It's certainly weaker, and it only goes up to 4 milligrams, whereas ZINs go up to at least 12. So it's weaker, but we'll survive.
I don't get how you don't die off of 12 milligrams in. Like, I've done 3 before and I get sick every time. I don't. That's insane to me that people are out here with 12 milligrams casually.
Yeah, I can't even do 12, really, not sober at least. But you get used to like 4 milligrams after like a few days, so then it just goes away.
It's a dangerous game. It'll be interesting to see, with the Breakpoint conference coming into town. I'm sure there will be some cans of ZIN snuck into the country, and I'm curious how that will play out. There was a thread on Twitter of like laws in Singapore, and I'm sure some shenanigans will take place.
Yeah, you should send me that. I'm like hilariously unaware of foreign countries' laws. That's like I didn't know it was actually illegal. And so I had like 40 tins or something in my luggage, and people were like, dude, you can't do that. I was like, what? It's so weird because cigarettes are allowed. But anyway, it is what it is.
Yeah, it's an interesting law. I'd be curious to hear why, because ZIN is, like, of all of the kind of drugs, if you will, very non-intrusive. Like, it has no smell. You don't spit. Interesting lawmaking. This has been a recent theme, is laws we don't like. But yeah, excited for Breakpoint to kind of get kicked off, especially on the journalist side. A lot of exciting announcements that it seems like are coming out that I'm excited to get to write about in the newsletter and chat about with you here. But for today, we have a slate of stories we're going to go through. I think the first thing I wanted to chat about is the death of Friendtech. Rest in peace to the SocialFi app of 2023. Roughly a year after it went viral, I believe, in maybe August of last year. And after the founders of Friendtech raked in tens of millions in fees, the founding team renounced control of the smart contract, which essentially means they can no longer upgrade it, and functionally, like, the app still exists, but they're walking away from the project. Mert, I saw you immediately on Twitter saying that you thought the idea behind Friendtech was good, which I have a suspicion I'm going to disagree with, but I wanted to hear you expand on that take a little bit.
Sure. I think the fundamental idea behind SocialFi in general is very interesting because a few reasons. One of them is that social networks are roughly the strongest networks on the internet that I'm aware of. So, for example, it's super easy or super difficult to overtake something like Twitter or TikTok or Instagram because these social networks keep getting better and more useful the more people join them. Like, that's a network effect. And it's very difficult for any traditional company or startup to actually take on these people. Like, it's basically impossible. I mean, Meta owns, Instagram, Messenger, Facebook, WhatsApp. There's also Telegram, and crypto is, or SocialFi specifically, is the first time I've seen where you're able to bootstrap a new social network from scratch at insane velocity and also have another level of virality built into it. If you remember when Frentech went live, it was acquiring new users at an insane pace. And so I like it for that fundamental factor. And also, crypto is super social in general. Like, this is both good and bad, but the good, like the bad, is obviously speculation drives most things, and it's mostly social consensus that matters. But the good thing is that it is social, meaning that there is a lot of communication between folks, just currently on Twitter. But also, like, conferences, for example, I think Breakpoint and Token have like 20,000 plus people coming or something, which is crazy. I think it's like the most sold out Breakpoint. It sold more tickets than the past ones combined, for example. And then you take something like the newer consumer face or focus that crypto seems to have. It's still not there, but like, it's getting there. The infrastructure is much better than it was last year, at least. And you take these factors, and then maybe even add in the fact that Solana mobile or there's other efforts to make consumer apps more mobile. You take these, and I think it's something that genuinely is impossible without crypto, and it's something that can actually help improve existing networks if executed right. Now, I don't think Frentech executed correctly. So, for example, the bonding curve was very predatory. And then the gating mechanism is basically like an OnlyFans thing where it's a creator chat, but that's just one instantiation of that concept. Like, you can do other concepts, like you can do it via email, such that you can just email creators based on buying their time or something. Um, or just having like some sort of social value determined by the market, I think is interesting. I don't know if it's good or bad. I think it certainly is easier to make it worse than better, but I don't think that means the entire idea is bad. So, and the other anecdotal part here is that the three social apps that I've seen on crypto are roughly the only apps I've actually used, like myself. I mean, I use Jupiter to swap coins, and sometimes I'll go on a perp stacks if I'm feeling like speculating on the price of something, but I don't actually use anything other than a wallet and just staking. And the social things I actually use myself. I thought it was fun, and especially with like time.fun, if I'm like super busy, I can just kind of put my time on there, and people can, if they're really keen to do like a startup pitch or something like that, they can message me on there or get advice. Same with like fantasy, which is like the card game, like fantasy football, but Twitter personalities. I think that's cool. That's still SocialFi. I think that's probably the best concept I've seen, because it's literally just a card game and fantasy sports and betting on Twitter. And so I think if one of these SocialFi apps can figure out retention as well as they do customer acquisition, and I think they will, because I think it's a very new field. I mean, Frentech launched last year in the middle of the bear, and I think with some years of like learning, like, don't make the bonding curve so crazy and predatory for retail, um, continuously iterate, etc. I think there's certainly a shot at it being one of the biggest use cases of crypto.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Back when I started full time at Blockworks about a year ago, one of my first assignments, they were like, "We want you to write the definitive piece on what SocialFi is. Like, just, friend tech was big at the time. Look into all these apps, try to define what SocialFi is, because it was a term people were throwing around, but it was unclear what exactly it even was. And I think the conclusion I came to through writing that is that I think these SocialFi apps are fundamentally uh, kneecapped, or they're given a ceiling through the fact that they're financialized, because the currency of social media is the ability to have a big social crowd. Like, if your platform doesn't have a lot of people on it, no one's going to want to go there. And a lot of people don't want, some people do, but a lot of people don't want to have a financialized experience on social media. And as you mentioned, this was kind of the issue with friend tech, was you had to, I believe, I actually never used it, but I think you had to like fund an amount of ETH into a wallet before you could even use the app. Like you said, it had this kind of OnlyFans gating to it. But I just don't think there's a long track record or a lot of examples of social media apps that went a financial direction and it really worked. I guess you could point to OnlyFans, has it's been in the news recently for just booking incredible revenues, but that's for very specific reasons. And I think Friendtech tried to do something similar, because it was like, oh, if you can join Mert's group chat, he can tell you when to insider trade the latest Solana thing. And but I don't know if that was enough of a value prop for people to want to use the app. And I just think that I'm maybe more interested in social apps like Farcaster, which has, financial aspects. I guess you can pay using warps to do certain things on the Warpcast platform, but apps that are overtly financialized, I just feel like are going to have a ceiling, because a successful social app is going to need to go as broad as possible.
Yeah, I think Friendtech is a subset of SocialFi, but I don't think it represents all of SocialFi. So, there was another like BitGo or something, some BitClout, or another version of
BitClout,
these.
yeah. The
Yeah,
guy just
like
got
that.
arrested, I think.
Yeah, like that just didn't make sense. It's and what I mean by that is, like, you can add social. I'll put it this way: I'm referring to SocialFi as the intersection of social and crypto, but that takes many different shapes. Like, you don't have to pay to do stuff. You can also just have a small, like, I think Fantasy Top's a good example. You're still using social network APIs, let's say, but you are basically playing fantasy football, and you don't have to play it, and it also doesn't have to be like big or something, but it's still like a game that you can play, and it doesn't affect your social media experience, let's say. And I don't think you need to. I certainly think there's a lot of mechanisms here, and the reason why there's no precedent is because it's super early. It's like one of the rare cases where it actually is early. Like, people in crypto love to say we're early, but we're not actually early in most aspects. But for SocialFi, I actually haven't really seen it fully explored. And so my tweet was about, I think the execution in this instance was bad, but I don't think the concept is flawed, meaning that like social tokens, for example, I don't think are, or like, you can even maybe make the argument that like NFT communities are SocialFi in a sense, because it's still like heavily social and there's a small financial element for some parts of it. But I do think that it's a problem that will be solved, because it basically must be solved. Like, social media can't be centralized forever. I think Farcaster is a good example. I would still call that SocialFi, but like, people might disagree with how I classify that. I'm an investor. I do use Farcaster pretty much every day. And there are small financial elements, like being able to tip people, and also like certain elements around the chain itself. But it's not like overly financialized. So I think something like that, certainly. I was actually thinking of rebuilding like certain components of email on crypto rails, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to be done there. And so one thing I would be cautious of in crypto, or in startups actually in general, is there's like this cynical, pessimistic tendency of people to say, like, this has been tried before, it didn't work, and therefore it will never work. But like, if you look at the history of basically any company, that only like you have to ignore that as a founder, because there's always something different you can do. You can always go through the idea maze, figure out what failed. Like maybe in the case of Farcast or Friendtech, it was multiple things, and so it's hard to overfit on that one example. But like many things did not work before they worked. Like there's a great book by Matt Ridley, How Innovation Works, which is basically examples full of this, where it's like somebody did something, it didn't work, somebody did something, it didn't work again, and then maybe the market changed, maybe the timing was different, maybe the tech was slightly different. And so I would just be cautious of ruling out the entire category based on, let's say, some some bad execution.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I'm interested in the Drip House on Solana. I think that's, again, debatably not really SocialFi in the way that a lot of the apps in the category exist, but the idea of like a direct to consumer model for creatives to more directly connect with their fans, and it makes tipping easier, and it all runs off of microtransactions, which are one of these kind of unique use cases that crypto enables. I think stuff like that I'm really interested in. I think that could take off like tomorrow. And they have a social app coming soon and stuff like that. I guess also, as I'm thinking about it, like if you make Venmo 10% different, it kind of becomes SocialFi. Like that's a big just kind of money transmission app, but you have to put in a profile picture and send money to like friends and put a reason into the ledger as to why you did it. And they've kind of structured that app to look like a social feed. So I guess there are like things that are somewhat of the way there. Obviously, the Venmo example isn't good because you're not trading or speculating. You're just giving money to your friends. But I don't know. I'll be, I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But as of now, I'm not as interested in SocialFi as a use case. But on this idea, I suppose, of uh, use cases within crypto, I was interested to get a little bit into it with you, Mert, on this discourse currently about the lack of exciting ideas in crypto. You had a long tweet on it, and there also was this tweet by Travis Kling that got a lot of engagement about quiet quitting in crypto. And I just did an episode of the podcast with McBrennan from MarginFi, kind of on the idea that there's a lot of stuff floating around right now that crypto's stuck in a holding pattern a little bit. There aren't exciting novel ideas. It's a lot of copycat projects and infrastructure. So maybe just walk me through your take, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit.
It's actually very closely related to my last point about crypto being extremely social, and this idea of not trying things because they were done and failed before. It's actually super related to that, because one of the biggest problems I see in this space is the lack of bold bets. And it's partly, in my view, because crypto, it's so socially driven, meaning that, hey, I'm going to buy token because the other person is buying token. Okay, so now the other person is buying token because the other person bought token, and then so now you have this weird social propping up of the coin, let's say, and we call this community in crypto, though I don't really believe that's what makes a community. And as a result, what happens is these people kind of develop like a hive mind. And what that means is there's a lot of social consensus, meaning that, let's say so imagine this. Imagine somebody released Friendtech V3 tomorrow and they just named something different. It would get destroyed on Twitter, right? It would say, this already failed, like you're trying to scam us, you're a horrible person, go die. Like people get pretty intense about this. It's like that's actually very dangerous for the industry, I think, because the second you're discouraging people from coming up with ideas that were different than before, simply because they didn't work in a different format before, then you start getting stagnated. And what ends up happening is, it's not like it's just retail that's immune to this social mimetic force. It's also VCs, right? In fact, I would say VCs are maybe even more social. Like a VC won't even invest unless like most VCs won't invest unless you have a lead investor that already, let's say, takes the burden on doing the diligence and saying, I'm going to put my money here and put a lot of it. Once you get a lead, everybody starts investing. In fact, the round then becomes oversubscribed in most cases, and it's super social. And so this also happened to Solana, right? There was a period of time, and it's still kind of prevalent a little bit, where people thought Solana was dead because people on Twitter socially were just like, oh, it's dead, it's dying. FTX was the only thing, doing this. And then what happened was that VC funds not only wouldn't fund Solana teams, they would tell their portcos to not build on Solana or give advice to not build on Solana. And there's like a new term for this called Ebola. It's like EVM bags over logic affiliation or something that somebody came up with. And that's dangerous because generally founders, like if a startup idea is already obvious, then it will already be done. But most ideas are not obvious and they're somewhat contrary to social belief in some sense. And like that's the defining trait of, like, for example, Uber, get in a car with a stranger, right? Or like Airbnb, go sleep in a random person's house. It's like those ideas are not obvious ideas. And if you do them, you'll get, let's say, a lot of feedback from the market saying you're wrong. Or even with like Dropbox, I think when Dropbox came out, the comments were like, well, I can already store stuff on my hard disk at home or something. This is totally unnecessary. And now crypto, like startups already like that, and they're hard, and they require you to have some insight that other people don't. But when you add crypto's social element and like mimetic ape elements, let's say, that becomes even harder. And then that's, as if that's not bad enough, the incentives are such that there's liquidity right away in most cases, right? In a general startup, you lock up your equity for years before you get invested. And even if you do get invested, you're not going to get a liquidity event unless you get acquired or go public. So everybody has an incentive to actually be in it for the mission and solving a problem. Whereas in crypto, you can just be part of a team for 6 months. The team might release a token in 4 months, and now you're rich. And now it's like, okay, your incentives are maybe not the same. And so you combine these things, and it becomes a pretty bad environment for bold ideas, in my view. And you can also kind of already see like parts of it fading away. Like I think decentralization used to be much more important 2 years ago than it is now, where now most protocols like blockchains will just not be decentralized in any fashion at all, and people seem to just not care anymore. And it's just when you add up all these things, you make it harder for the industry to achieve, or ecosystem teams to achieve PMF. And without PMF, all you have is the current use cases, really, which is stables, which stables are fine and useful, but they're also centrally controlled. And like, for example, actually, that's a good segue, because like decentralized algo coins, or decentralized stable coins, they don't have to be algo coins. They were tried in some multiple formats. Some of them are still around, but like there was a huge failure in Terra, right? Like UST. And now it's like, okay, well, if you even mention that word, you're a scammer, right? Like, but if it's very possible that there's a bunch of founders that are actually interested in decentralized stables, right? Like that concept is interesting. And so if you have these filters that are so preemptive and overfitted, combined with the social element of like mob mentality, it's not a great recipe for innovation. And we certainly need more innovation in crypto.
On a positive note, though, I do think that when I started covering Solana, I felt like this is one of the benefits of having a fast and cheap chain. Well, I guess particularly a cheap blockchain, because it's not expensive to try bold things, or as expensive. You can like try something really crazy and you're not going to bankrupt your family for generations if the idea doesn't work out. So that is one positive side of it. But I think overall I'd agree with that. Have you What do you think about vape to earn on Barachain? Speaking of bold ideas.
Um, I personally don't get the concept. I haven't looked into it. I believe the problem, or I mean, one of the problems was that it was marketed as something to help you quit smoking, but like vaping is still smoking, obviously without certain other chemicals, but it's still not good for you, and you're incentivizing people to do it more with a token. I'm not sure how that works. Um, and but what's interesting is I would actually bet that probably still has more PMF than a lot of the use cases I've seen, um, because I mean I don't agree with the products because I mean I don't vape. Zinter, now that might be interesting, although I'm not sure how that would work.
You get
Um,
sued is what would happen.
yeah, probably, but like it's just there are some bold ideas, but they're not bold in the sense of like we're gonna redesign hardware from the scratch and set up an entirely new telecom layer or something. Like Helium actually is like a great idea in my view. Um, or HiMapper. I think HiMapper is a bold idea. We're gonna map the world and take on Google Maps. Like that takes some guts and some crazy thinking. Um, just more ideas like that. And obviously, ideas alone don't work. That's part of what makes this hard. You need relentless execution for many years, which then the liquidity aspect comes into effect. So it's just a numbers game, like finding these use cases and better products, and the numbers are not skewed in crypto's favor.
So a sort of related point that I want to bring up, or something I've been thinking about recently, is I wonder on this idea of bold ideas if it also makes the goalposts unnecessarily narrow, if that makes sense. So I'll call this, like, just bear with me, but this is 2020 Donald Trump syndrome, where that crypto has, where in the 2020 election, Trump had this whole narrative he spun up around Biden of, oh, he's senile, he's so old, he's stuck in a basement, he can't even string two sentences together. And then the presidential debate happened, and Trump had set the goalpost, or like the bar, so low for Biden that just by getting up there, and like, he was old at that time and he wasn't his sharpest, but just by like stringing a couple sentences together, Biden suddenly looked like he had done a really great job, in that debate. And so I just wonder, and like, the point I'm trying to make here is that the goalposts determine how successful you appear. And I wonder if crypto has basically oversold what it's going to do in the world, and if that makes it look like there's a lack of novel ideas. Because as you mentioned, like, stable coins are a big use case that currently exist, and they facilitate dollarization and in countries that have, hyperinflation in their local economies, and there's like already reasons why people could use crypto. But have we sort of come to a place where we've oversold what crypto is going to do in terms of, rewriting the financial system from scratch? And maybe you as a founder, and lots of people in crypto want that to be the case, but are we in a world now where the bar is too high for what it means for crypto to succeed? And can crypto basically take the current world and not completely change everything about finance, but moderately improve the status quo? And is that success?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think most industries go through this basically. So like AI, for example, has been a thing for decades. There was like a big ML craze like 10 years ago when I was still in school. It's like, oh, these things are intelligent, they can understand everything you're doing and stuff, and that was just not the case. And I was like, okay, is it over? This is all ML is good for, like recommendation engines on Netflix? And then like ChatGPT came out, for example. Same with like AR, VR. That was certainly oversold. Like, oh, like you're all going to live in the metaverse and all this, and like that's still not there today. Although I think it'll get there. So I think it's an interesting point to consider. Certainly, that could be the case. Certainly, it could have oversold. Um, like it's super hard to predict these things. That being said, I think part of being a founder is kind of basically having a vision that you think the future does look different in a specific way than today. And so I think like that you should take those shots, because ideas are not like world changing ideas are not common, and if people start preemptively filtering them out, then they're even less common. And actually, Patrick McCormick has a good post on this. It's called Capitalism Unchained. And basically, he argues that capitalism is the best system that we've been able to discover in, let's say, best economic system that we've been able to discover compared to the other ones. It's still not perfect, but it's the best one we've seen in practice. And he argues that if something is super important in its end states, then entrepreneurs will figure out a way to make that reality over time. And I think he gives a few examples of how that's true. I don't remember those examples today. But there are a lot of use cases where existing systems would be better with crypto. Not all. Like there's a lot of systems where it doesn't make sense to use a blockchain. But there's certainly some. And I don't even think we've executed on those. And I think once you start executing on those, then the bar gets pushed a little higher and you start from a slightly higher base point, and from there maybe you can go even higher. And so I do think it'll take time. Like people kind of say things like mass adoption, anytime now. It's like I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I don't even think any blockchain is ready, like physically speaking. I don't think any blockchain is ready, not even Solana. No L2, no L1, nothing is ready. They all start crumbling under pressure in some regard or have some glaring weaknesses. But yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say. I think my position on this is I have a vision that I think things can get better than the way they are. And so it's worth taking that shot. It's like if it fails, then it just fails. But at least I tried.
Yeah, and obviously you need to like plan for the furthest outlier scenario, but in the range of possible outcomes, maybe crypto falls somewhere closer to the middle. And I don't think that necessarily means that crypto has failed or whatever. Is what I'm driving at there. The Sei network brought parallel execution to the EVM with their V2 update this past spring. Sub-second finality and massive throughput are now available to EVM developers everywhere on Sei's high-performance Layer 1. Incentives for users are coming to Sei this month from teams like DragonSwap. Start farming on Sei today by visiting dragonswap.app. That's dragonswap.app. Thanks again to Sei for sponsoring today's episode. I want to dive into some more Solana-specific kind of news for the rest of this roundup. So the one I'm maybe most interested to get into is just a lot of questions facing Solana validators right now, which is obviously an area you're quite able to speak to, Mert. And it's something I've been thinking about a bit and writing about in our newsletter a bit recently, because there's a few different interesting things. So first of all, Solana TEV and I believe issuance is like down in dollar terms just because the chain is getting used a bit less and the price of SOL is down from where it was earlier this summer by about $20 or so. On top of all of so just top line validator revenue is a bit down. Then for smaller validators, you have the Foundation Delegation Program, which is sort of this grant program that helps smaller validators exist on the Solana network. They lowered the caps for the commission that those validators could charge. So it becomes even more difficult for them. And then the third kind of factor here is that if you're a validator that needs to attract stake, which is kind of the whole ball game for validators, is attracting more stake, marketing yourself well. There's these stake pools, and the biggest one is Jito. The second biggest one is Marinade, but Marinade just switched to an auction model where validators basically have to pay Marinade or bid for Marinade's stake, and the highest bidder brings home the stake. And sort of the accusation being lobbed at Marinade, which seems like it has a little bit of accuracy to it, is that the only validators that can profitably bid for Marinade's stake are ones that are sandwich attacking users. So that's like all out on the table. I guess the place that I want to start with you, Mert, is just, I mean, Helios obviously runs a big validator. Like, what has been your experience of the staking world recently? What's kind of your outlook from where you sit in the ecosystem right now?
I would say a lot of people have a relatively mistaken worldview of how a proof of stake system is supposed to work. It's some of the comments lead me to believe that they actually view it more like socialism, where you should just equate stake out to smaller people so that they get bigger and then take from the bigger to get to the smallers. And that's just not how it works. There's an entire literature of history of how that model of value distribution is not sustainable and it just leads to mediocrity. I think one of the things that people need to understand here is it's actually not unlike, let's say, the US federal system, where you vote for somebody to, let's say, represent your state, and that person represents your state in the federal government or something, right? Um, it's actually kind of like that. And so, what that means for Solana, and what that means is you stake with validators that give you the most value or are more the most aligned with your values, something like that. Now, it can be economic values if you're purely interested in economics, in which case you would obviously stake with, let's say, the lowest fee validator or the highest APY validator. But like those are relatively close together. Like there's not that much of a difference between the top and the bottom. Like Helios is at the top of giving APY to stakers, but it's not like by that much. It's it's like a few percent points, point percent points even. And so then what happens is you just like that can't be your only differentiator. So you need to provide some other value to the ecosystem that the stakers are like, I trust this person to not only validate blocks and also give me good returns, but also I believe they make the network better through such and such. And so I'm going to park my soul with them, right? That's how it works. Like, I think a lot of the reason why people staked with me in Helios is because, we not only do we run a developer shop for Solana and other products on top of Solana, but because I've been advocating for Solana and like trying to help clear up all sorts of misconceptions for years now without rest. And so I think based on what people have told me, like they appreciate that. And it's like, okay, here's like a very cheap way to support you, right? Because the rewards mostly go back to you with the exception of block rewards. And that's only for now. And then you make money on top of it while supporting somebody who's engaged in the community. So it's like a win-win. And so I think if you're a small validator, and I mean, like we were small too, right? Like it's not like we just started being number one. I think what you need to do is you need to figure out a way to provide as much value as possible to your stakers. And that's just not going to happen by merely existing and lowering your fees because that's a commodity. Anybody can do that. Now, what's not a commodity is perhaps like brand. Let's say, so for example, Lane has a website that lets you gain insight into different validator metrics and tools to help you. And if you like those tools, maybe you'll stake with them. Same with like Cogent, for example, has like a calculator for validator profitability.
Solana Compass
Um,
is one.
yep, Solana Compass has some good education, and Overclock is developing a new client for node types on Solana. And so it's like, okay, if these people are not only validating the network and also giving me good returns, but they're also giving me value as a holder of Sol and also a participant in the network by improving the network itself, it's like, why would you not support them? You want to give your tokens to who has the most merit so that it's like a synergy, right? Like they get better, you get more, they get more, you get more, etc. And then ideally, some people are like, okay, well, I also want to provide value. And now there's this free market of competition between people providing value to different people. And so that ends up looking like a more functional system.
So I guess like I'm curious then, you know, do you think that the market is going to end up caring? Because say you're a smaller validator. um, Dan and I already got into this whole question of what's the value of small validators, the decentralization bit, but just in the pragmatic world we live in, say you're a smaller validator, you're the caps are lower, you can charge less of a commission to be part of the foundation delegation program. You need that program to survive. Um, is it actually a feasible pathway forward to try to start marketing yourself and getting people to stake with you? Or do you think it's going to be a world where there's like 15 big validators that sort of provide services to the ecosystem and also can provide competitive yield, and those are the ones that are going to win out? Because I guess I'm somewhat doubtful that so like there was a new stake pool called Aerosol, or no, Aeropool. So Aerosol is like a liquid staking token on Solana. They just launched this thing called Aeropool that seemed like it was a little bit of a shot at Marinade and said, this is a stake pool where we reward Solana ecosystem contributors. Like, stake with us and you'll get this yield and it'll go to the right places. I sort of think that like over the long term, the market is going to reward whoever passes along the highest yield, just because that's ultimately the most measurable outcome that people are going to go for. But I don't know, like, do you think it's a feasible pathway forward? Or maybe a better way to put it is like, if you're a small validator and you're wondering right now, like, can I make it? Can I turn a profit? Do you think there's actually a pathway forward to existing?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, certainly, like any validator has a chance at existing and becoming number one or just being higher in the rankings. But you have to remember, these things are businesses, right? Like running a validator is serious business. You're validating the network, you're voting, you're using funds. Like, it is a business. I would eat like a mental model that's relatively faulty, but one I still use is like, it's a convenience store in like a busy city. It's like there's a lot of other convenience stores too. Like, why should people use you? In a general city, you'll benefit from there obviously being more tourists or more people in that city, and maybe one convenience store has better location and maybe has better products or something more fresh. And so you have to like differentiate yourself. I mean, fundamentally, you're running a business. You're generating income. That's a business for doing something. And so most businesses are obviously not successful. And this is the same. You're not going to be successful just because you exist. And I would say it's actually bad if you were successful if you just existed, because you don't have an incentive to keep adding value to the network or providing value to your stakers. And so as a small validator, if you're struggling, I mean, my advice would be to just same as any other business advice. Like, if you're struggling, figure out a way to add value to people and figure out a way to market, to get distribution. Um, Maybe that's like partnerships with certain stake pools or something, or protocols. For example, I believe like Jupe has a few partnerships with other validators like this. And so it's just never going to be like, that's just not how the world works. That's what I mean by the socialism aspect. Like, you're never going to be you're never going to make it just because you're small. Like, being small is not a virtue. It just means you're just beginning out, and you still have a long way to go. I mean, there's nothing stopping people from adding a bunch of value, maybe and like, it's unclear if a validator should be like a solo operator, which I think is harder to do. I think it can still be done, but if you're a protocol that's already doing things on the network, then it obviously makes sense for you to run a validator, right? Like, Circle has to run a validator, because if they don't, then they can't detect. Let's say everybody colludes against them. If they just run their own validator, they can detect this. And Jupiter, right? They don't run, well, they actually don't run their own validator. They get another team to do it. But they run a validator. And so same with Jito, right? Like, Jito is a MEV infrastructure. They still run their own validators because it helps their business. Same with Helios. We run the validator because it helps their other business too. And so perhaps you need to add a new business line, or but there needs to be some way, because unless you want like some top-down controlled structure like socialism, then there is no other way in a free market other than competing, right? Like capitalism is about competition free competition. There is just no way other than that.
But also, like, the market isn't fully rational right now, right? Because I wasn't able to find good stats on this, but I feel like it's thrown around a lot that Coinbase takes a pretty hefty commission, but it's still, I don't know, the third largest validator, and Binance is top 10, I believe, and like the highest yield validators don't necessarily that's not necessarily reflected in the rankings of stake size right now. There's also this like branding thing that shouldn't matter, but it seems like it does. And I guess it's also like Coinbase just has distribution, so you should add that in. But there's not fully like a rational outcome right now in the staking landscape.
Well, I mean, I don't think again, there's a lot of validators that provide the same fee and take the or give you the same results, but there's also a big element of trust, right? Like you trust the network, like the operator, to do the right thing, to act on the network as if they know what they're doing. And then in the case of like Binance and Coinbase and even Galaxy, there is also a lot of regulatory arbitrage where they, like in the case of Galaxy, they handle the FTX estate sale, so they benefit a lot from that, which like that you just cannot compete with. Although Helios did surpass them, so take that.
Had to throw
But
that in.
but like Coinbase, for example, has a custody thing, right? And if you're custodying with Coinbase as a large institutional person, you're already trusting them to do such and such, and then maybe the default is it just uses the Coinbase stake or validator, and so distribution is absolutely a big factor, and that's what I mean by it's not just about APY or just about existing and running the code. It's like as a business, you need to consider the business facets of running a node. It's not just running the software and plug and forget. Yeah, it needs to be treated like a business.
Yeah, I'll be interested to sort of like put a pin in this. I'll be interested to see some of these exchange LSTs come to market as well, and sort of how that affects all of this. Because I believe Binance's LST that BN Sol is trading today. I want to say I saw that somewhere, and they obviously run a validator, and so does like Binance's distribution help it to draw more stake and things like that, even if it's not the lowest commission validator or things like that. It'll be interesting to watch. I guess just one other related question I wanted to throw off you, Mert, is I had this interesting conversation yesterday with Michael Rapetny at Marinade, the I guess core contributor over there, and because there's a lot of critique of the stake auction marketplace right now because you can go on Solana Compass and see that its biggest, like the most Marinade stake is with D's node, which is sort of widely thought to be sandwich attacking users. Um, and as we know, like sandwich attacking is this kind of malicious form of MEV where users, like unsophisticated users, get a worse price, kind of unbeknownst to them, and this benefits more sophisticated validators. This is broadly thought to be a bad thing, even though MEV generally isn't seen as bad, and most Solana validators make use of like MEV mods. Um, so and I was like talking to Michael, and he basically said, "Look, you can't fix the negative externalities of MEV, but you can pass this MEV back to stakers in the form of yield." So basically, like, I'm not going to solve sandwiching, but I can offer a better yield, and so that'll like it ultimately trickles back down. Um, I,
No,
I don't know. Yeah.
that's absolutely not correct. I'm not sure why I would say that. Certainly, the MEV being in protocol, and like not all forms of MEV are bad. Like you can do arbitrage between a centralized exchange, a decentralized exchange. Like maybe prices are better as a result, or something like that. Atomic arbitrage, like these things for price discovery, generally aren't. They're not like good or bad. They just kind of are. They don't really affect users too much. Um, and like that can actually, and it is with Jito at least, passed back to the stakers in the protocol. That already is a thing. With a stake pool, it's entirely different, right? Because if a stake pool is delegating to people, sandwiching people, they're incentivizing sandwiching. Okay. So, and this is, I mean, you'll see totally say this all the time. And we're also adding this at Helios, and I think Jito will add it too. The way to fix this, one of the ways to fix this, not the only way, is if you have a stake pool, you do not delegate to people who are actively sandwiching retail, right? It's social. It's a social consensus mechanism, right? That's how it's like a vote, right? Like if I don't want to vote for the president who's going to jail me, I will vote for the other president, and then people who want to jail me will not be president. It's a very basic mechanism. So I mean, I didn't actually know that Deej node was the biggest whatever for Marinated. That's actually like fucked up in my view. Like that's a very well known sandwicher. And him saying that, I'm not going to get too mean here because he's not here, so I won't say anything. But like that is objectively incorrect. A stake pool can help reduce sandwiches quite a bit by simply not delegating and having a stricter criteria.
Yeah, we might have Michael on the pod at some point to chat about this more. So yeah, would love to give him a chance to put it in his own words because I'm obviously relaying what he said. But I think one of the points he brought up is like, look, MEV can only really be, or like sandwiching can only really be solved by like the Solana core. It's not something that validators can fix.
That's not true
And
either.
I mean, I guess there's a point there insofar as I feel like just, uh, setting high slippage and using that to detect validators or like malicious validators isn't going to root out sandwiching. Like you could just spin up a different validator and go back to sandwiching, right? So it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole game. Um, you don't.
You can, yes, it is a whack-a-mole game, but the incentives obviously are super important. Incentives make the system, and so the incentives are actually to reward the sandwiches in this case. That actually makes the problem worse. So like, if you're not going to make it better, like don't make it worse. I think that'd be a good starting point. And there's certainly ways to help fix sandwiching without Solana Core being involved in any way. I mean, for example, Solana Core is not even responsible for sandwiching right now. It's largely due to, well, you can argue the shred or the transaction forwarding can lead to it. But fundamentally, you need like a Jito bundle to land. And that's not Solana Core. It's also, I wouldn't say like Jito's fault or anything either. Um, it's just the incentives of that system, which is why it's important to design the incentives correctly. Otherwise, people will sandwich. Um, and like there's obviously app level solutions to this where the slippage like can just be not that. You can make use of limit orders, etc. Like there's a whole bunch of different ways you can tackle this. RPCs cannot send to validators that are known to sandwich. For example, we're actually doing that. And we're going to release a new tool for it as well, so people can configure their validator sets that they can send to. But incentivizing the behavior is crazy. Like that cannot be. I just don't. That feels super wrong to me. Or saying that only Solana Core can fix it. That is just wrong. It doesn't feel wrong. It's just wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll be. Yeah, I think having Meredith on the pod at some point, so it'll be interesting to get more into this. But I think we'll move on there, and I think the last thing I'd wanted to chat about a bit is DePIN. Uh, we've spoken about DePIN a bit on the pod, but I don't know if it's been super in depth, but it seems to me, Mert, that DePIN is sort of having a little bit of a moment as far as mind share, or there's just like a lot of new DePINs coming to market. There's one today that I can talk about because by the time this comes out, it'll be public. But there's a renewable energy company called Fuse that's doing like a tokenized marketplace for renewables. There was a flight tracking DePIN named Wingbit that just did a raise. There's a third DePIN that I just got pitched on their raise that's, above 10 million. So it just seems like, yeah, we're seeing a lot of new ones come to market. There's a lot of investor interest. And, a lot of these run on Solana due to the cheap fees thing. So I guess I'm just curious, like, do you think DePIN are like is the vehicle for these bold ideas we spoke about earlier? Like, is this kind of the killer use case that's been hiding in plain sight?
Yes, I think it's one of them for sure. And I've tweeted about this multiple times for years now about how I think it's the most exciting sector in crypto because it's in like we named High Mapper and Helium as examples like 50 minutes ago as well about bold ideas because it's the one of the because it allows hard tech founders so things with like hardware capex to bootstrap networks that they couldn't have done otherwise. So like it would not be feasible for anyone to take on Google Maps because Google Maps has insane scale. But if you somehow weaponize every driver in the world with something that's crypto incentivized to take on Google Maps, that actually works probably, and they're making good progress. And there's a bunch of networks, and like the way I think of crypto, inspired by Chris Dixon's book, is it's a new way of building better networks. It's a new building material for networks. So that could be social networks, it could be financial networks, or it could be physical networks. So in the case of DePIN, that's what they are. And there's a lot of physical networks that are just super outdated and don't necessarily make too much sense. And they're also super prone to monopolies and centralization, right? Because hardware businesses especially benefit from distribution and scale. And once they get that, it's very hard to beat them. Like producing chips, for example, I mean, that's a bad example. But there's, just manufacturing, for example, things like that are almost impossible to take on unless you have a 0 to 1 kind of idea and the tech breakthrough. And so I do think it is my favorite use case of crypto and the most interesting. And we have, Solana. I mean, we did the migration for Helium back in the day when they were migrating from their own blockchain to Solana. We were working with them at Helios, and I was super excited about that because they use compression to mint large numbers of hotspots on chain, for example. And that just kind of goes to show you the scale of one giant L1 that's composable and with parallel fees so that the fees can remain predictable for non-overlapping states. How that can enable kind of these interesting cases. And then it's interesting also because once you get like a critical mass of these folks building in the same community, then they like learn from each other. Like High Mapper and Helium are good friends, and then other people kind of join the network or community, and they learn some lessons. Maybe they use the same open source code for like DePIN distributions or something. And so then you also get a secondary network effect as well. And yeah, I think, I mean, maybe not to mid curve this. I think the left curve answer is it's definitely great because it allows you to take bold bets. Like hardware is just hard, right? Oh, I guess that's kind of a pun, but it's just very difficult to bootstrap these networks on your own. And there's a bunch on Solana like that. There's also like Cusco, which I'm an investor in, which uses unused data center bandwidth for LLM inference tokens, and like that's pretty cool. And render GPU networks, obviously, you can do storage. There's a whole kind of load of these, and so yeah, I think it's underexplored because like these people are generally real builders who don't even really go on Twitter that much, and so most people just aren't super aware. And they're also like relatively niche things. Like I'm not going to talk about how bullish I am on mapping the world every day, for example. Um, and and so it's like there's that aspect to it, but like make no mistake, they're extremely interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's better. Like I think Helium sort of learned this the hard way. Like if your DePIN token becomes too much of a speculative thing, I think it actually takes away from the mission of the DePIN a little bit. Like I just don't think these tokens can be the like get rich quick tokens or like the speculative AI token or whatever. And like because Helium has like a real business. I mean, especially now with Helium Mobile, like that's a real business that solves a problem. It's the cheapest cell phone plan you can get in the US if you combine the fact that you can get paid with token incentives. Like I use it for my own cell phone, and on multiple months I've been like basically paid to have a cell phone plan, which is crazy because I sell the Helium tokens, and that more than pays for the $20 a month that they're charging. I don't know if that $20 a month thing is sustainable, but like that's a real business. And when people were complaining that HNT wasn't returning them enough to run the hotspot, I think that was all kind of missing the point. And I think, yeah, some of these DePIN projects will do well if they stay away from the kind of overly speculative side of things. I'm really curious, speaking of Helium, how they're able to operate the way they do. Like, it's a crypto project that runs a nationwide cell coverage plan in the US. Like, the crypto companies have a horrible time operating in the United States, but I don't know. I don't think we're ever going to get to see kind of what the conversations they had with the government were like, but I'm very fascinated with what that did look like.
Yeah, I mean, they do have a foundation, and so I'm guessing, once it meets a sufficient level of decentralization, that rules out a whole bunch of things, and so yes, it's a very. I didn't even know you could make money back on Helium, even though I'm the CEO. I don't think they had it in where I was, but that's we need more ideas like that, basically. Yeah.
Well, they basically you turn on your location services in the Helium app, and it tracks where you are and if they have enough cellular coverage there, and then like based on how much you walk, which since I live in New York, I always hit like the maximum amount. They'll give you a certain number of tokens for that day. So it's sort of like you're being paid for providing your location service to the network, which I'm more than fine
Mm,
to do because I think everyone's tracking my location anyways. But
yes.
yeah, definitely one of the more promising apps. And I was interested. You kind of brought up earlier, like there's two apps that I use in my day to day life. I think it'd be fun to survey kind of crypto founders and people in the ecosystem of like, okay, there are all of these apps. Which ones outside of trading do you actually use? That could yield some interesting results. But look, that's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, Mert, thanks for making the time zones work and hopping on a roundup. Excited to kind of get to chat with you a little bit about Breakpoint since I won't be there. Best of luck with all of the I don't know, APAC crypto stuff you're doing right now, and we'll see you on the next one. This episode would not have been possible without the Sei network. Don't forget, user incentives are coming to Sei from teams like DragonSwap. Make sure to check out Sei today. You can start farming on Sei by visiting dragonswap.app.